welcome to this Trailhead live session. This is all about how analysis drives up adoption. My name's Ian Gotts, I'm the CEO of Elements.cloud. I've been a customer of Salesforce for about 18 years. I've written a number of books around business analysis, change and Salesforce, and I've been passionate about helping people improve the way they adopt and implement Salesforce, and particularly around the whole business analysis. So what I want to spend some time talking to you about is how you can drive more rapid implementation, but more importantly, that implementation is one that is adopted by your end users. So let's start by a confession, one of the org confessions. In this case, I've picked number 751, which just shows that great adoption starts with actually having great user engagement. So the confession is, spent 3 hours putting a change into production after weeks of designing and testing. By the end of the day, we had to turn the new process off as the whole sales team were up in arms about the process as they'd never been consulted on it. And I'm sure many of you who are listening can relate to that. But I mean, obviously this is an extreme example of poor adoption, but adoption is almost a spectrum. It happens at different levels. At the left of this diagram, you can see users who never ever log in. So they've had a Salesforce license bought for them, it's been provisioned, they've got a user account, and they never ever log in, and you can see that from the login accounts. At the other end, you've got people who are clearly using it and offering feedback, and therefore care about the application that you've built, but it's not quite working how they wanted. And then you have everything in between. So you've got people who use it when they only have to. It's not their go-to application, but they know that if they don't fill out their forecast, they're not going to get paid. So they're using it under duress. And then slightly better than that, people who use it, but they find it confusing, it's time-consuming, it's frustrating. So if we look at some of the ways of mitigating that adoption, it varies massively based on the level, the issue that people have with adoption. At the never logs in end, the interesting question is, so what are they using instead? Are they using Excel spreadsheets? Have they found another cloud app? What are they using? They clearly are getting their job done and they don't use Salesforce, so they must be using something. If they're using this under duress, then how do we redesign the applications that they're currently using to make sure it fits their process? How do we make sure that it is the application that they would naturally go to first? Moving up the scale, they find it confusing. Great, okay, so how can we help them use the application better? Is it in-app help? Do we need to optimize the page layouts? How do we simplify it so it makes it easy for them to use first time so they're not wasting time? And finally, we've got the stars there, the people who offer feedback. That's great. How do we accelerate our response to that feedback? If they're making suggested changes to the application which are sensible for everybody, how quickly can we get those into production so that we're reinforcing their positive impact on, or their positive view of the application that they're using? First of all, I want to think about the overall implementation lifecycle. And I think a number of people who are out there, maybe are new admins, as far as they're concerned, the view is I can build stuff, I can use flow, how do I add new objects? But there actually is an entire life cycle which actually starts with analyze. Understand what your business users really want and need, not what they thought they wanted when they asked for this new thing. So how do I capture the requirements from the different places it comes from? Statements of work, interesting ideas, genuine feedback. How do we capture those? How do we then validate and understand them? How do we then understand the implications of the changes to the system? And then how do we write a user story? And I'll talk about this a little bit later. But how do you write a user story that you can then pass over to the development team? Now, I know if you're a solo admin, you are both the business analyst and you're the admin, but it's still useful to think about each of these different activities with different hats on, even though it's you are the same person. So when you're in build, you need to make decisions about whether you configure it or code it. You need to document the changes you made, you need to test them, and then you're into the deliver phase. And that's where we roll it out, we deploy it, load any data, then release it so it's now into production. So that's the grey boxes of deliver. And then into operate. So now we've got in live in production, we're monitoring people's usage, seeing whether people log in. There's backup and restore. There's compliance, are people following due process if you're a highly regulated organization. And then training, so we're providing in-app training, but then importantly for this conversation, we're capturing feedback in the moment. So when a user is confused, when a user has a suggested idea, we can capture that feedback, which then fuels the cycle again. So that feedback goes into requirements and we start the cycle again. If you haven't thought about the implementation lifecycle in these terms, I would encourage you to spend time going back and really understanding each of those different steps. At the back end of this presentation, there are some resources which talk about, which show you how to understand this in a bit more detail. But if you haven't got this understanding about the implementation, then you're missing some foundational skills. You won't necessarily find this in Trailhead, which is why we're doing these Trailhead live sessions. But this is foundational skills, whether you're an admin, a developer, a business analyst, or even the project manager trying to implement Salesforce. And the trick here about this implementation lifecycle is we need to drive it as fast as possible to make sure that we're driving the business changes that are required, particularly with digital transformation. The current environment now is that digital transformation happens in 5 weeks or 5 months, not 5 years. And that means the business needs to change quickly, and therefore the underlying systems like Salesforce need to be able to respond very quickly. So we need to go around this life cycle quickly. And by the way, you can't skip any steps. Every step needs to be done, even though you may do them quite quickly. But if we're doing this fast, we need to make sure we do this with a level of adoption, which is really the heart of the presentation today. And the last piece of the item there in terms of trust, any of those changes we put in, we need to make sure that we don't break the org. We need to make sure that, yes, we're doing it quickly, yes, people are adopting it, but we're not putting the business at risk by breaking our Salesforce org because we're putting changes in that have an impact we didn't expect. We need to minimize those unintended consequences. So let's go and take a look at each of those adoption issues and how we might be able to address them. So let's start with the left-hand end. Never logs in or logs in under duress. And both of those are very similar problems, which is the applications that we've built clearly don't support the business processes that our end users are following. So you might say, well, we just need better training. We need to make them follow those due processes and make sure they use the application properly. And my experience over the last 20 plus years is that that's a battle you're never going to win. If the salespeople, service teams, field service reps, if they don't have the application that supports them, they will find an easier route. It's rather like water running down a hill, running down a mountain. It will find the easiest path. And that is true for end users. So we need to understand what they are doing, the way their business operates, and then build the applications which support that. Our job is not to make sure that they follow the application we've built. The business is what pays our bills. We need to make sure that we've built the applications that supports them. So how do we do that? Well, we need to engage really in the entire analysis lifecycle. We need to go back to our end users and understand what their true requirements are. That means those soft skills of questioning, understanding what they really want and need. We need to map the processes so we understand what their business operations like to validate those requirements. We need to understand what changes are likely to be made to the system and the impact. And then most importantly, we're going to generate some user stories because that's what gives the handoff into the build cycle. So let's look at the next situation where people are using the app. You can see from the reports that the users are logged in, they're using it, but maybe they're finding it confusing. It's wasting time. If you think about if you can save 1 minute for a user on one screen, which they use 5 times a day, and they've got 100 users. I think that adds up to something like 40 hours a week of saved time. So it's not just about adoption, but it's actually about saving time for your end users. And there are a couple of ways you could do that. One is that you can start to look at how you can provide more help, either the help that's provided for most fields, 255 characters of text. You could use the new features in Summer 20 in terms of the pop-up help, or you could start to look outside at some third-party applications that provide in-app help, obviously companies like Elements. That's the first thing. The second thing is about simplifying page layouts. It's relatively easy now using something like Elements to look at a page layout and see whether fields are being used, whether there's any data in them, and whether they could be either removed from the page layout, or using, say, Lightning, you can start to make fields dynamic. So sections of the page can be dynamic, and therefore they only appear in certain circumstances. All of this is trying to simplify those page layouts. And I know many of you are out there and you have page layouts that look like CVS receipts. And I always say the confused mind says no. If you can simplify those page layouts and provide the right level of help for those fields which are important, either have validation rules or they kick off flow, you'll improve the data quality, you'll speed it up for the end user, and they're more likely to start putting the right data in and using the application as you expected. Now, if you're thinking about that analyze phase, that is both feedback, trying to capture feedback from the end users to understand why they're confused. It's also understanding whether you can remove fields, that's the org impact analysis. And then it's a user story. That user story is what triggers the build work. That's the technical requirement that gets fed into build to make the changes to those pages. So let's get to the last situation where the end users are offering feedback. And you might say, well, Ian, that's not an adoption issue. No, it's not an adoption issue, but it's clearly an adoption opportunity. They are suggesting changes to make the application work better for them and for others. So how do you accelerate your response to the feedback so that they're seeing the changes or suggestions they make implemented in days, not weeks or months? Often end users don't bother giving any feedback because, do you know what, they give up hope. There's no chance those changes are ever going to make it into the application, or if they do, the cycle is maybe 3 months. So how do we get that positive feedback of saying, that was a great idea, it's going to be in the new release next week? And that's clearly the whole of the analyze phase, but starting just to the right with feedback. So feedback feeding into requirements, understanding the operation or the changes through the process maps, understand the implication of the change through org impact analysis, and then driving those user stories. And you say to me, well, hang on, Ian, that can't possibly happen in days. We have to go through this cycle properly. Let me pick that up in a moment. I really want to go through how this process works and then help you understand how you could maybe short circuit some of this and get those changes into production far quicker. So therefore it's done more quickly. The business can start improving the way they operate. So therefore you get a double benefit there. But before we get into this whole risk-based approach for releases, let's just think about this analyze phase as a process. So you can see in the green we've got a couple of inputs. We've got submitting feedback or fixing technical debt, and then coming in from the left, we have requirements that come in. And what we often find is that both feedback and technical debt and those requirements come in as at different levels of detail. It could be a statement of work, it could be suggestions, it could be some random wishes, and inside that could be a few gems. And the issue is that the feedback and the requirements that we capture often are what we call raw requirements. They are wish list items, they are very high level of detail, or they're very low level of detail. High level might be, we need Einstein. Low level might be, I need this pick list item and it has to work like this. And our job as the business analyst or the admins is to validate those requirements. For two reasons. One is we want to make sure that those requirements genuinely are what are required. But secondly, we need to understand them so we can group them into releases. And the way we do that is by mapping processes. We need to understand the business process, and that will help us A, validate the requirements, but B, it will also identify new requirements that the end users hadn't considered. So let's take the example of let's say a new pick list item. Someone says, I need a new pick list value. So yeah, I'm sure I could add that. Absolutely, I could add that pick list value. But the question is, what else is required? If there's a new pick list value, does that mean I need to change some validation? Does it mean there's something that goes on a report or a dashboard? Is there maybe it could be implemented better as a new record type? So we can't take the requirements at face value. We need to validate them in the context of the business operations. And before you start going, oh, processes are going to take years to map, let me show you a way that you can map out something very, very quickly in maybe less than an hour, and you can engage your end users with them. A simple approach that works really well. Once you've mapped that process, you then have your list of your final requirements from which you can write your user stories. So if you think of requirements as business jobs, the user story is the technical job. That's now handing off to the technical team what you want built. Obviously, those user stories will be linked to the process maps to give them some context. It'll be linked to the requirements, so the technical team can understand a bit more about why that user story has been written in a certain way. But at the same time as writing the user story, we then need to perform some risk analysis on the user stories. And that risk analysis is critically important because it then starts to help us understand how we group the user stories into a release, and then what risk level the release has, so that determines how we deliver it. Low risk releases can be delivered very quickly, potentially straight into production. High risk releases clearly have to go through a more rigorous build, integration test, and rollout cycle. So if we just summarize this diagram here, we're getting feedback, we've got input where people have identified optimization opportunities, removing fields. We have requirements coming in from the business, from end users, and all of those feed through into writing user stories, which can then be fed over to our development team, who can, as a release, as a user story is a release is a collection of user stories, and therefore those user stories can be configured, coded, tested, and then delivered as a release. So I said I'd talk about an approach for mapping processes which is very quick and easy to use to engage with end users. It's called UPN, Universal Process Notation. It's been around about 20 years, so it's not specific to any particular application. It's proven in organizations from global multinationals down to innovative startups and non-profits. And it's very simple notation. And the reason it needs to be simple is that, first of all, we have a number of audiences who we need to appeal to. It's the end users for engaging them to understand how their business operates. But also this content can be delivered inside a Salesforce app to help them understand what they're doing. So this is training for the end users. It's obviously useful as context alongside the user story for the technical team when they're building the application. Thirdly, management can look at it because the management teams can start looking at it to work out what the key metrics are. Often the metrics are the ones that are most easily measured rather than the ones that drive the right behavior. If you understand what the processes are, you then pick the right metrics. And then finally, if you're in a highly regulated industry, then these process diagrams are the ones that the regulators look at, the auditors look at. Provided your end users have got access to them and that's what they're following, then this is the best way of making sure that you can demonstrate you're following regulatory compliance. So let's look at this, this format in a bit more detail. First of all, no more than 8 or 10 boxes on a screen. We know that the confused mind says no. If you have 10, 15 boxes, 20, 50 boxes, then people are likely to glaze over. Second, we need only 8 or 10 boxes on a screen because we need to make sure that this is displayed in an app. No longer are we printing process diagrams on massive printers and sticking them to walls. This stuff needs to be consumed inside a browser, ideally alongside Salesforce. So that's the first thing, no more than 10 or so boxes on a screen. If you need more detail, then you'll see the little corners there. That means there's a lower level diagram, which means that you can build out a hierarchy of diagrams. So you might have 8, 10, 20, 100 diagrams that build out to drill into more detail. The next thing you'll notice that every single activity box starts with a verb. Report, restore, resolve, test, analyze. So the best approach is start every activity with a verb. The next thing you'll notice is every single box has a line coming in and out of it, and those lines have text on there. Again, really important. It may seem trivial, but again, those lines are the handoffs. If you don't have any lines between boxes, then it's pointless even drawing the boxes. So the discussions often in workshops are a lot more about what the handoff is and a definition of what, in this case, say, out of box 2 we've got resolve sales support request. What does resolve mean? So the discussions are about the handoffs or the actions that come out of each of the boxes. The other thing you'll see is there are no diamonds, there are no decision boxes. But if I look at box 4, there's an implicit decision inside that box. So we use the square boxes as decisions as well. And if we need to understand how the decision gets made, easy, we just drill down to the next level of detail. The next thing you'll notice is there are no swim lanes. Swim lanes tend to make the diagrams more complicated because you're trying to draw the diagram so the boxes fit on the right swim lane, and therefore it messes with the natural flow of the diagram. So instead of swim lanes, we have resources. So if you look at the bottom of each box, you can have one or many resources there. The added benefit, of course, is you could then run a report on, show me everything where this resource is used. And finally, you'll see some of the boxes have got little paper clips. And this is where you can attach supporting information, which could be notes, it could be a link to a specification, it could be a link to the metadata item that is which is changed or used to make this process work. So a particular box could be linked to an object, a validation rule, a page layout, or Apex classes. So there's quite a lot of information contained in this diagram, but again, keeping it simple for the end user, and that's what UPN, Universal Process Notation, is all about. So the other concept that often I find that people don't understand is the fact that is a user story. So people tend to say, well, I write requirements and we use the requirements to go and build the applications. As I think you saw from the earlier process, there are a number of steps from getting from requirement to getting to a technical specification you need to hand off to your development team. And that's called a user story. And user stories have a standard format. It's as a ... I want to, so that I can. And this is again a standard format used across the industry. And those user stories may be pushed off if you're in a large organization. They'll be defined and then pushed into Jira or Agile Accelerator. So that's where those user stories are managed, where the technical teams are managing a user story, actually tracking the work, the development work against the user story. So again, simple format, as I want to, so that I can. I'd like to add one more item, which hasn't been talked about very much, which is adding a risk level to a user story. Is it high, medium, or low? And we need to assess that user story because then it means that we can understand the risk of a release, and then we can understand which development process we use. Low risk user stories, low risk releases can go through a far faster, cheaper release cycle, and they can get into production more quickly. So the way we look at user story risk, we look at it from two perspectives: impact and complexity. So we look at the impact from a technical perspective. If I change these metadata items, what's going to break? If I change this pick list item, what are the knock-on effects of that? So I can understand the technical complexity. I can understand what the operational complexity is. How much does the business have to change? And I can do that by looking at the business processes. And finally, on the impact, that top level, I can look at the regulatory impact. Are we going to break any compliance regulations? So those three aspects, we can then decide whether the impact is low, medium, or high. We can then look at the user story and understand what changes need to be made to Salesforce, and that will determine the complexity. So we may have actually a high impact set of user stories, but actually they have relatively low complexity. So therefore it's only medium. We may, the other side, we may have a very low impact change, but it has quite a big implication in terms of how we go and build it because of, say, the architecture that we're trying to work with. And therefore that will be low impact but high complexity, and again that's medium. So you can see how quickly we could start to assess the risk of a user story and then roll those user stories up to the release. And then once we know that, we can then determine which release approach we use. So if it's high, then we'd obviously develop in the sandbox, test in the IT integration sandbox, and then deploy to production. But if it's low, we know it's low impact, the release is low impact, then we could develop straight into production. Now I know people are throwing their hands up in horror going, you can't develop in production. But the reason that people don't develop in production is because they don't understand the risk of what they're doing. Because to date it's been very difficult to understand the risk of any changes. You make a change without understanding the risk, it blows up in your face, the org gets broken, and therefore you realize you never should have developed in production. But that's because that release really was high risk or medium, not low risk. So only if you can really understand the risk of your user stories and therefore your releases can you take this approach. And obviously applications like Elements.cloud allow you to do that risk analysis because we're doing all the heavy lifting. We're doing all the analysis of every single metadata item every night. So you can use that as input into your risk analysis. So I've talked about the different aspects of adoption, the different problems that people have, ranging from people are not using the app at all to people are giving feedback. And every one of those, as you can see, feeds into this implementation lifecycle. What I would encourage you to do is, first of all, understand how this lifecycle happens in your organization. If it happens in an ad hoc way, then start to try and validate it and get it institutionalized. So at least everyone is talking from the same terminology, they understand the power of analysis, they understand what the build steps are, they understand what they're doing and deliver, they understand what's necessary and operate. I think that's the most important thing in terms of getting anyone on the same page. Then you can start to address the adoption issues. And then the last thing I talked about was how you can start to use a risk-based approach around user stories to be able to implement more quickly. And therefore drive up the speed of implementation, drive down the cost of implementation, and drive up the level of adoption. So 3 takeaways from this session. First of all, you need to understand the scale of your adoption issue. Second, you need to understand that business analysis, that analyze phase, is at the heart of the issue. And the third is that you cannot start build until you have a really clear understanding of user stories. In terms of resources, there is a success community, the business analysis success community. We've written some training that augments the training that you find around Trailhead. So if you go to train.elements.cloud/BA, there's some business analysis training there. And then also we have defined that risk approach as a document, and there's the link to the document that we created around taking a risk-based approach to releases. And again, if you have any questions, please feel to reach out to me. Here are my contact details, ian@elements.cloud, or my Twitter account, which is @IanGotts. So again, thank you so much for joining me. Please reach out to me if you have any questions or want to question, challenge, or debate any of the things we've been talking about. Let's continue the conversation.